Hi, my name's Bella, and my favorite book series is The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. I'm super excited for the new prequel that comes out this year, like really soon. So I've been rereading all of the books and sharing my thoughts with you here on YouTube. I finished book 1, The Hunger Games, and book 2, Catching Fire previously, so if you want to catch my thoughts, you can look at my other videos for that if you want. It is time for the third book in the original trilogy, Mockingjay. So yeah, let's read it. So the way that I've been doing these rereads is by reading the book one part at a time and then pausing and sharing my thoughts. So I'll read part 1, share my thoughts, and then go on to read part 2. And then at the very end of the book, I will share my thoughts on the entire book. I am not specifically setting out to explain the entire plot of this book. Instead, I'm trying to tell you about thoughts that I have or themes that I'm noticing, interesting moments, or just anything that sticks out to me. But what I will say is that because I'm explaining all of that, I inevitably talk about the plot a lot. So you'll get a decent amount of plot. Just know that my intention is not to give you 100% of the plot. Okay. Also, because of that, this is a deep dive on this book. Expect spoilers for the entire book. Yeah. Anyways, I think that's all that I wanted to get out of the way before we start talking about the book. So let's get into it with part 1. So we left off in book 2, Catching Fire, at the end of the 75th Hunger Games, with Katniss being lifted out of the arena, not having won, but having broken the arena. And then she is in a hovercraft headed to District 13. And the very, we get the kind of iconic very last line in the book, which is Gale saying, "Katniss, there is no District 12. So that's where we ended with book 2. Part 1 of book 3, Mockingjay, is called The Ashes, and we start out with Katniss in District 12, or rather what remains of District 12, which is not much. And we go through in part 1 from that all the way to the, I think, third interview that is aired on TV with Peeta, that's President Snow and Peeta. And Peeta ends the interview with "You in District 13, you'll be dead by morning," or something like that. And they see Peeta fall to the ground, get kicked, and there's his blood on the ground, and the feed cuts. So all of part 1 is taking place in District 13, which is Katniss's new home, and also the new home of everyone who survived the bombings of District 12, which is not that many people. And I think this part is mostly getting adjusted to this new home and the new normal, I guess, or what Katniss's role is now, what everyone is up to, and kind of finding out where everyone is now after the Hunger Games kind of ended in chaos, and then District 12 refugees were taken in by District 13. We do find out that pretty much every district, I think we found this out at the end of book 2, but we know that pretty much every district is openly at war with the capital. So there's a new status quo. I have a lot of notes already. And as usual, I'm gonna share a couple of major thoughts or themes that I have about part 1. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about in part 1 is District 13. What is that, and where is that, and also who? The main questions. So first of all, we find out that District 13 is actually quite close to District 12. I forgot to note down the exact words, but towards the beginning of the book, there's something about it being maybe a week's journey on foot or something like that, and only 45 minutes in hovercraft if you're going direct or something. So it's quite close. We also, like, when learning that information, we learned that the two refugees that Katniss met in book 2 didn't make it to District 13, but Katniss notes that, like, they were really close. So that's kind of sad. District 13 is almost entirely underground. So we find out that District 13 was previously responsible for, like, on what was said District 13 was responsible for was like mining, graphite mining, but in reality, they created nuclear weapons for the capital, which is actually part of the reason why District 13 is still around, but I'll get to that in a second. But so after the war, 75 years ago, District 13, the top level, like whatever was visible on the surface, was basically completely destroyed by the capital. And now District 13 is almost completely underground. So they have this, like, basically a bunker that is super deep levels underground where everyone lives and works and where, like, all of District 13 exists. District 13 is described as, like, I would say pretty militaristic. So again, everyone, like, lives in a bunker. They have they call each other soldier, and it's not 100% clear to me if you have to, like, be signed up as a soldier to be called soldier, or if that's just the title that everyone has. But Katniss specifically mentions that, like, District 13 takes in all of the District 12 refugees and then calls them soldier, which is, like, a title of respect. So, but, like, everyone's soldier, which is kind of weird. Also, everyone in District 13 wears matching government-issued gray clothing. They get a tattoo on their inner forearm every morning with their daily schedule, but it's, like, temporary and it washes off at the end of the day. And also Katniss talks about how the food is, like, the portions for food are allocated to be exactly how much calories you need to get you through the day. So depending on what, like, work you have, you'll have like literally it's, like, mathed out to be, here's the amount of food you need for the day, and that's the serving that you get. Food can only be eaten in, like, the cafeteria area, and you cannot take food out of the cafeteria area. That's, like, basically a crime. So there's a lot of, like, pretty strict rules that are definitely new for Katniss and new for folks from District 12. And it seems like District 13 is, like, militaristic, but also just very efficiency driven. Like, there's no waste, there's no, like, there's even a moment where I think Fulvia, which is Plutarch's, like, assistant, writes a few words on a piece of paper and then crumbles it up to throw it away, and people from District 13 look at her like, what the heck are you doing? Because, like, you don't waste anything. You use everything until it's completely used up. Like, Katniss talks about getting hand-me-down shoes that don't fit because, like, nothing is new. Everything is reused, recycled until it's totally trash. Anyway, so that's a little bit of, like, background on District 13. We learn a lot about District 13 and that, like, setting. Some other, I think, some other pieces of information about District 13 that I think are worth pointing out. So one, I sort of, like, mentioned this earlier, but District 13 survived the Dark Days, or, like, the First War, because they produced nuclear weapons for the capital. So the way it's described in the book is that when all of the districts are at war with the capital, District 13 basically says, like, we'll nuke you. So do you want to do that? And District 13 and the capital strike a deal where District 13 is able to pretend to be destroyed and totally gone. And, like, they're cut off from the grid, they're cut off from communication, they don't exist, but they stay alive in exchange for not destroying the capital. And this works for both of them because basically, like, I think the capital also has nuclear weapons. So it would be, like, if District 13 sent nuclear weapons to the capital would send them back. It would be mutual destruction. And to avoid that, this is the deal that's struck. So that's why District 13 is still alive. Also, there is a little bit of information about why District 13 was interested in rescuing District 12. Also, we have kind of we have a lot of moments where District 13's previous inaction is questioned largely by Katniss, and where we kind of wonder why District 13 didn't do something before, but they are doing something now. And there is mention that there was a previous pox epidemic that like wiped out a huge portion of District 13's population and also left a lot of the remaining population like unable to have kids. So District 13 has been pretty like damaged by that, and it made them not able to step in and help with previous rebel efforts. And also that like at the same time could potentially be part of the reason why District 13 stepped in to like take in the District 12 refugees now, is that like someone describes them as like additional breeding stock, which is kind of a wild way to think about people, but it also goes into this like efficiency driven mindset of District 13. So kind of interesting. It seems to me, at least in part one, like District 13 has been pulling the strings on this rebel effort for quite a while and is quite involved, but they haven't sent in soldiers or support to help the districts, and this pox epidemic sort of explains why. Another kind of challenging moment that happens in District 13 is that we find out that Katniss's prep team from the Capitol is in District 13, but is held in this like cell and has been physically harmed. And this is a bummer. This stinks. But I think the biggest thing about this moment is that Katniss and others from District 12 are forced to face the truth that like the horrors and the punishment and the like human suffering that has happened because of the Capitol in the districts sort of also happens in District 13. And so I think that's like it's kind of a small moment, and, you know, the prep team is rescued and they're okay. But I think it's a really significant moment because we're setting up this idea that like, is District 13's version of the future better than the Capitol? And like District 13, as of everything we know right now, is definitely better than the Capitol. Like they're not holding Hunger Games and they're not whipping people and killing people. However, this is our first instance of like, okay, violence and punishment happens here too. So I think it's a significant moment. Also, last thing on District 13, we meet the president of District 13, Alma Coyne. Is her name Alma? Her last name is definitely Coyne. I hope that I said that name right. But we meet President Coyne. She's very no nonsense, and she definitely, yeah, she's no nonsense. I think that's everything there is to say. But yeah, that's District 13 so far in part one. Another major theme that I'm seeing in part one is this idea of the rebellion as a performance, similar to really the Hunger Games. I think there are a lot of instances of this in part one. We start early on with understanding that the Mockingjay position requires a prep team and a camera crew and speechwriters and like all of these people creating the Mockingjay that is then presented to the world. We also have this major section where Katniss's prep team basically tries to turn her into the Mockingjay, and it's a spectacle that involves a ton of makeup and Cinna's costumes and like special weapons that like look really pretty, and like a studio setup with like fake smoke and this like line that everyone worked really hard to create, that Katniss kind of like bombs at. But like the Mockingjay as a symbol is not really, at this point with District 13 and the rebel effort, it's not a, you know, natural, just like, here you go thing. They have to sort of like present it and work on it. And I think at the same time, we also have this really interesting moment where after Katniss tries to film their like special rallying cry and it's terrible, Haymitch calls this meeting where he's like, okay, let's take a step back. What are the actual moments that you felt inspired into action by Katniss? And they're all moments that are actually like totally unscripted and just Katniss. And I think we're like, I don't know, we're still in the early days of seeing Katniss as this like mockingjay figure in this book, but it is really interesting to balance this idea of like, what's the mockingjay? Is it Katniss in these moments of, you know, pure, unscripted, just her being herself? Or is it this glammed up, costumed up, film crew, whatever person? And like, I don't know. I think it's interesting to think about. Yeah, because like, I think like a thing that I really feel, particularly when Haymitch does this whole meeting about like what are Katniss's inspiring moments, I feel this strong sense of Katniss being like so brave, and I think that is the thing that makes her so inspiring as the Mockingjay, is like she's willing, you know, she volunteered for her sister when she knew she would probably die, and she, you know, decorated Rue when she knew that like that was not what the Capitol wanted and it would not reflect well on her. And then even in the moment in part 1 of this book where the hospital in 8 was bombed, she goes up onto the roof immediately and like stands up to shoot at the bomber planes because like she knows she can help. Like she is brave. She's a really brave person. And a lot of the people in the districts, I think, are inspired by those pure, unscripted moments of bravery. However, no one in the districts would know about them if she weren't in the Hunger Games and on film and, you know, raised into this position of publicity because of circumstances outside of her control, because of her prep team and the Hunger Games and etc. So anyways, I'm rambling at this point, but I think it is a very interesting concept and an interesting balance to see how everyone around Katniss is trying so hard to create this spectacle of the Mockingjay and the rebellion, but it's not super clear which moments are the inspiring moments, but also, does it matter if the reason that we're seeing those inspiring moments is because of the spectacle that's generated? Anyways, I don't know. I think about that a lot. Another major thought that I have in part 1 of this book is the fact that Katniss has power and also is potentially a threat. So I think I've talked about a lot in previous books how Katniss like doesn't have a lot of power over her situation, and a lot of her story is stuff that is done to her, and not stuff that she has control over. And this is, I think, the first time that we see Katniss as having power that she can control and wield. And we see this particularly, I think really the only moment we like fully see this is when we're in District 8 and Katniss is visiting the hospital, and Katniss like goes through the hospital and like all of these people who are sick and dying and injured are like, their spirits are lifted just from her being there, not even doing anything, just from her being there. And that's like a really incredible kind of power. I guess also there's another moment of us seeing her power, and that is after the first propo is aired and people in the district start to see it. We hear that there are districts who previously their efforts to fight the Capitol were not going very well, and now the tides have turned and they are succeeding, and that's because of the inspiration of Katniss. So like, she does have this power to motivate people into action, and we know that she has this power, and also that it is a potential threat to one person in particular, Coin, because we see Coin do a couple of things to sort of remind Katniss of her place. The major one is when Katniss agrees to be the Mockingjay, she has President Coin call this like public assembly where Coin announces that she'll be the Mockingjay and also shares Katniss's terms, which include full immunity for all of the tributes from the most recent Hunger Games, and I guess all of the victors in general, in case they say anything against the rebel efforts. This is specifically because PETA is saying things against the rebel efforts on TV. But at the end of that announcement, Coin sneaks in that if Katniss does anything counter to the like Mockingjay effort, that immunity is gone. And I think like Katniss perceives this as like a reminder that Coin is in control. And also I think a piece of proof that like Coin recognizes that Katniss has power and wants to make sure that it doesn't get out of hand. So yeah, I think that's interesting. That'll be interesting to see develop. But yeah, I think we're finally seeing Katniss having power. The next thing that I want to talk about from part 1 of this book is Gale and how I think he kind of represents war. So I think we're seeing a more violent side of Gale. And I think it's not really that Gale hasn't been violent before. We know that he hunts with Katniss, and we also know that his thoughts towards the Capitol are pretty, not necessarily violent, but like they're very negative, and he's not afraid of sharing that. But I think he's starting to say things that we just like haven't really heard him say before that are pretty violent, and that like I think show a person that is like willing to be at war, willing to fight with the Capitol, which like we're kind of already at war with the Capitol, so it's not new information necessarily, but he represents like pro-war, I think. And I think it's definitely impacting his relationship with Katniss. So anyways, let me say some examples. So one, there is a quote from page 31 in my book where Gale says, "If I could hit a button and kill every living soul working for the Capitol, I would do it without hesitation." And I get that the Capitol has like killed countless children from the districts in the Hunger Games. The Capitol is cruel and violent and willing to punish and kill people. So like kind of fair. But I think that that is a very violent sentiment. Like that is maybe the most violent thing we've heard Gale like outright say. Gale also completely like sides and sympathizes with District 13. He doesn't have any empathy for Katniss's prep team when they find them like kind of held in a cell and not necessarily tortured, but like definitely not tortured. I don't know. Maybe tortured isn't the right word, but like they're punished. They're physically punished. And Gale thinks that that's okay. We also hear him share his idea for a trap in the room with the hummingbirds, a trap that plays on a prey's like natural instinct to flee danger. And, you know, we're just talking about hunting and birds, but it's kind of still a rough idea. Like it's just violent. While they are in special defense or while they're with Beetee in the like area with all the different weapons, they're looking at all of the like super fancy bows and stuff like this. And I think Katniss says something like, that doesn't really seem fair to the deer. And either Beetee or Gale says like, well, we wouldn't be using it on deer. And Katniss says something like, so to Gale, so it would be easy for you to use these on people. And like Gale doesn't say like, yeah, of course, it'd be so easy. I think he says something along the lines of like, I didn't say that. But the vibe that I'm getting is that it would be easy for him to use them on people if the people are the Capitol or represent the Capitol. Like he absolutely thinks that the answer to the violence of the Capitol is violence. And I don't know. It's like, that's what everyone is doing. That's what war is. That's what rebellion is. Like, I think it's not possible to fight back against, in this world, it's not possible to fight back against the oppression of the Capitol without violence. Like, it is absolutely necessary to this cause. But I think that his, like, push towards violence is definitely causing a bit of a rift between he and Katniss. There's a quote from the book in chapter 9 that says, "The glue of mutual need that bonded us so tightly together for all those years is melting away." And that's about Katniss and Gale. And I think like Katniss is thinking or maybe starting to see that the tight friendship that they had was based mostly around the fact that they both spent all of their time, all of their free time at least, out in the woods hunting to feed their families. And Katniss is seeing that without that, they are different people. And I think this is interesting because it goes back to conversations that Katniss had or like thoughts that Katniss had in books 1 and 2, where, you know, when she's in the capital and she's seeing all of this like opulence and all of this food that's just readily available, and she's thinking about like, if I didn't have to hunt all of the time, who would I be? Like, what would I do with my time? And now we're sort of seeing that for both Gale and Katniss, that like they don't have to hunt all of the time just to feed themselves and their families. So who are they? And the answer is they are different people. Gale is someone who is very willing and interested in fighting and participating in this war, and Katniss maybe isn't. I think Katniss is still not totally sure what she thinks. And I think also Gale is very much the opposite of Peeta, who I think is much more idealistic in this world of like, are we going to war? What is war? And obviously like Peeta's thoughts, I think, are not totally clear for a lot of different reasons, including the fact that he does not have the full picture because he is captured by the Capitol. But Peeta is saying, like, think about this. Like, if we go to war, we're all going to die. What's the point? And I think Peeta sees an opportunity for a more peaceful agreement instead of war, which it's so tricky because I think violence is absolutely necessary in this case, but also it's challenging. My thoughts are still forming. Anyways, those are all of the like major thoughts and themes that I wanted to talk about with part one, which, ooh, this is a lot more than I thought I was going to talk about. I have a lot of thoughts on this book, apparently. A major thing that I kind of didn't talk much about in part one is Peeta. We see Peeta a little bit, but not a lot. I know that we're going to get more of Peeta later in the book, so we'll talk about him later. Oof, it's rough for Peeta right now. Some other stuff that I wanted to point out, it is very interesting seeing Peeta at the very end of part one. He warns District 13 that they're in danger. Like he says, you and District 13 will be dead by morning. And I think at the same time, he's saying like, I'm calling for a ceasefire. This war is a bad idea because we're all just going to destroy one another. So what are we doing? And so I think it's interesting seeing his state. And it's not super clear exactly what his state is at this point in the book, because it seems like he is not with the rebel cause and going to war against the Capitol, but he's also still wanting to protect Katniss, and in order to do that sort of has to think about protecting District 13. And it's just interesting to see his state. And I also particularly think in that final interview where Katniss describes him as looking super distracted and out of it, and he's like easily irritated, and he's like tapping his foot erratically. I'm so curious to know what's going on in his head, and I think that we will find out, but not yet. Also, in this section of the book, we get the Hanging Tree song. We get the full lyrics of the Hanging Tree song, which is chilling and really, really beautiful. I think that song is so cool. I love it in the book, and I also love the, like, you know, the movies creating that song. But also, we hear Katniss, we also have Katniss sort of, like, talk about her interpretation of the song and how she realizes that by the end of the song, the, you know, the person who is saying these words, who's the voices of the song, he's calling his lover to die with him. And she talks about how when she was younger, that seemed so absurd. But she compares it to how right after the second Hunger Games that she was in, at the end of book 2, she wakes up and gets a syringe and wants to find Peeta to kill him to protect him from having been captured by the Capitol, because she thinks that they've both been captured by the Capitol. And she sort of says, like, I think I get it. Like, I understand. Maybe I understand this song better than I thought I could, whatever. And I just think that's really interesting. And I really like that we get her internal thoughts on that song. And then lastly, I want to talk about something that happens at the very end of this part of the book. It's page 130 in my book. We have Plutarch talking about what the book says is one of his favorite subjects, weapons mankind no longer has at its disposal. And then we talk about high-flying planes, military satellites, cell disintegrators, drones, biological weapons, etc. And it says the book says all of this was brought down by the destruction of the atmosphere or lack of resources or moral squeamishness. And then you can hear the regret of a head game maker who can only dream of such toys, who must make do with hovercraft and land-to-land missiles and plain old guns. And I think that there are rare moments in this series of Suzanne Collins being like, hey, reader. And I think this is one of them where, you know, it's this mention of like, we're at war and the people orchestrating this war wish they had all these horrific weapons that are the weapons that are currently used in wars today. And I don't know, I don't have like a full thought on exactly what this inclusion in the book means, but I think it's interesting to see. I think that Suzanne Collins, by the third book in this series, is like, hey, if you didn't know I was talking about you, I'm talking about you at us, the current reader. Like, yeah, I don't have full thoughts on this, but I think it's cool to see her, I think, get a little bit more bold and like, if you're not picking up the real life connections yet, you should be. Yeah, that's all. That's all. Whew. Anyways, okay, that is all of my thoughts on part 1. Boy, howdy, that was so much. Thank you for sticking with me. Anyways, I will see you very soon for part 2. So part 2 of Mockingjay is called The Assault. We start in part 2 right after PETA has given his like kind of cryptic but definitely reasonable warning while in an interview with President Snow on TV, where he says like, you in District 13 dead by morning. That happens. So we pick up right after PETA's warning with District 13 deciding to do a lockdown drill, because at that point they don't know if PETA's warning is like an actual real thing that's going to happen, but it's better to be safe. And also Coin says something like, it's been a while since we last did a level 3 drill or something like that. So anyways, they do a lockdown drill, which ends up being not just a drill because PETA's warning was correct, and then the Capitol like sends bombs onto District 13. Anyways, we start there in part 2 and we go all the way to Katniss joining the District 13 like military force that's going to participate in the like invasion into the Capitol. And she arrives in the Capitol with the rest of her squad, and then PETA joins them to replace someone who died. And that's where we end. I think part 2 of this book is kind of interesting because in some ways Katniss doesn't do a ton in this part. There is a lot of plot that happens. Like at the beginning of part 2, PETA is with the Capitol being tortured, and at the end of part 2, he's like not only with the rebels and with District 13, but with Katniss, like in her squad. So a lot happens with PETA, and a lot happens like internally with Katniss because of that relationship with PETA and what's going on with him. But for the most part, Katniss is like staying in 13. She spends a little time in District 2, and then she goes back to 13 to train for the military, and then she goes to the Capitol. So it's not like there's not a ton going on with Katniss specifically. However, there's a lot going on with the rebels. There's a lot going on with Gale. There's a lot going on with PETA, like a ton going on with PETA. So there's I think a lot of the plot happening in part 2 is about the war and the rebel effort in general, and less like Katniss specific, which I find to be really interesting because we get to learn a lot about like what's going on in the world, not just in Katniss's like mind. Anyway, as usual, I have a couple of major thoughts and themes that I wanted to talk about part 2. So the first thing and kind of the biggest thing that I want to talk about from part 2 is this idea of the rules of war, and like what are the rules of war? What I mean by this is we have a lot of conversations in part 2 about what is fair to do or right to do in war, and how different people have a different answer for this. So I think we have like PETA, who we don't really hear from him in this part about his thoughts on what's okay to do in war specifically, because he's kind of, I mean, he's just like recovering from being tortured for the most part. But we know his thoughts are sort of that like violence is not a great answer to solve problems. And then we have Gale, who we talked about this a little bit in part one, how he is violent and he is like tending towards violence as the answer for all of these problems. And his perspective is very much like, well, if the Capitol can do all this like violence and all of these terrible actions, then we can too. And we're sort of then seeing District 13 and the rebels operate on some rules of war that land somewhere in the middle of those two perspectives. So we know that the Capitol is like incredibly evil, and the things that they're doing within this war are evil. So in part one, we saw the Capitol bomb a hospital in District 8 where it was like helpless people who were sick and injured. And that is incredibly cruel. We also have seen the Capitol torturing PETA and Joanna, but like in particular PETA, where the Capitol used his own like memories of Katniss and like twisted them to make him confused and also doubt Katniss in general. So like all of his thoughts about Katniss have been poisoned, and that's like manipulation, and it's really, really evil. So the like there's no argument the Capitol is participating in war in a way that is incredibly foul and incredibly evil. But we're also seeing District 13 participate in war in a way that is pretty bad as well. And it's worth noting, like, I don't think that there is a good or kind way to participate in war. Like, everyone in this book recognizes the reality of war, which is violence. But like in this part in particular, we're really thinking about like, what's okay? Like, what is okay? How do we participate in war, but still, I don't know, remain morally not as evil as the Capitol, I guess. So we get a couple of moments of like this conversation of how to participate in war. One is Katniss joins Gale and Beetee when they are having a conversation about how to basically use Gale's knowledge of traps and snares to adapt like weapons against humans. So to use, like, he can design these snares that use a prey's like natural fear of noise or whatever to like trap them. And Gale suggests a trap where, and this is a quote from the book, a bomb explodes, time is allotted for people to rush to the aid of the wounded, then a second, more powerful bomb kills them as well. And this idea is that this trap like plays on humans' natural inclination to like compassion and the natural instincts to go help people that are hurting. And like at this point, it's just a thought. It's just like we're just having conversations about things that could work to kill people. But that's like a really, really insidious and evil thought and suggestion. And it's coming from Gale. It's coming from the rebels, not the Capitol. And I think Katniss hears that and is pretty shocked. And then we also get another suggestion from Gale that is, I think, similarly evil. And that is when they are working on District 2 and trying to like crack the nut, which is the big mountain where like inside of the mountain is the like central military hub for District 2 and the Capitol. And they cannot figure out like how to get in. And Gale basically says like, well, if we don't, like, do we actually have to take over this place, or can we just, you know, disable it? And Gale suggests creating avalanches down the sides of the mountain to completely block all of the entrances so that no one can enter or exit the like military base. And other people, after hearing his suggestion, are like, oh, yeah, well, there's also the train station, so at least people can get out on the trains. And I think Gale says something like, not if we bomb that. And so it's clear to Katniss and also everyone that like his thought, his plan, his suggestion leaves no survivors. And again, like Gale's justification is like there's a conversation where everyone is like, well, let's leave the train station open so that District 2 people have an opportunity to like come and surrender. And Gale's kind of justification or comeback is, well, the Capitol didn't give District 12 that option when they bombed the entire district and did not intend to leave any survivors. And so it's this really challenging struggle of like, Gale is right. This is the way that the Capitol is engaging in war. They are aiming to kill every district person who is in their way indiscriminately. They're not trying to give people an opportunity to surrender. Like the Capitol is engaging in war in the most evil way possible. But does that mean that the rebels should match that? And Gale's perspective is yes, this is war. And I think Katniss's perspective is, I don't know, because Katniss knows firsthand what it's like to kill someone and have to live with that guilt. And I think she's seeing that perspective of like, can we do that? Like, I don't know. It's really complex, and I really, really, really appreciate these conversations and these moments in this book because I think this is the heart of this story. Like, how low are we capable of going in order to push back against something that's even worse? And it's a really hard conversation. Also, there's another quote from Gale that I wanted to mention, which is, he says, "What difference is there really between crushing our enemy in a mine or blowing them out of the sky with one of Beetie's arrows? The result is the same." And so he's talking about how Katniss doesn't like his plan with the nut, but she was willing to shoot explosive arrows at Capitol planes when they were bombing in District 8. And I think this is another, like, we don't get a great answer here. Katniss's perspective is like, well, in District 8, those planes were actively bombing District 8, so that's different. But, like, Gale is, again, also right. Like, at the end of the day, you're causing someone to die. So, yeah, it's a really hard conversation, and I think it's really, really important to have in this book. One more thing I wanted to mention in my notes, with that last quote that I mentioned of Gale's, the whole like, what difference is there? Katniss sort of responds with like, with that line of thought, you can justify such levels of cruelty that you could even justify the Hunger Games. And so I think like, again, I think the reason that this conversation is so important is that the Capitol is evil and bad. We know that. We're totally on board there. But if you have to become just as evil to defeat them, what does that mean for you? Like, if you are, as the rebels, if you defeat the Capitol only to come into power and become the Capitol with the same level of, like, evil, then what's the point? And yeah, that's the conversation that I think is so important in this book and this series. Anyways, that is everything that I had in my notes about this idea of how we participate in war. I think I might revisit this topic at like the end of the book, but yeah, it's a big one. It's a big theme. The next thing that I wanted to talk about that's like another major area of focus in part 2 is Peeta. So like I mentioned previously, a lot happens to Peeta in part 2. At the beginning, he is like being held by the Capitol, but he's still sort of kind of fighting back. Like he's doing these interviews. He warns District 13 about the bombing. Like, I don't know, but he's held by the Capitol, and we've seen his like physical health at least significantly deteriorate. And also there's a big hint that his mental health is deteriorating as well. And pretty early on in part 2, Katniss realizes that everything that's happening with Peeta, all of his torture in the Capitol, is really to hurt her. And she realizes, like right after the bombing, she realizes, and then also everyone on her team kind of is like, okay, like the gig is up. Now she knows we're in trouble. But she realizes basically that like everything she does results in punishment for PETA, and that like basically she can't participate as the Mockingjay while he's being held by the Capitol because she knows that anything she does will come back on him. So the rebels, District 13, make the call to rescue PETA because basically they've lost their Mockingjay. Like, she can't help them while PETA's still in the Capitol control now that she knows this. So they rescue PETA, bring him back to District 13. He's a mess. And we find out super violently that PETA has basically been brainwashed and tricked into thinking that Katniss is evil and a huge threat and a capital mutt, basically. That she's been like altered by the Capitol to bring the downfall of all of the districts. And we find that out because he wakes up and tries to, like, Katniss goes to visit him and he tries to strangle her to death, which luckily doesn't work. But yeah, it's very dramatic. Anyways, then after that, in District 13, doctors are trying to basically like rehabilitate PETA, but he's in really rough shape. We learn that he has been subject to a type of torture called hijacking, where in the Capitol, they would try to revisit memories of his that relate to Katniss by probably like showing him videos of the Hunger Games and stuff like that. While he is under the influence of tracker jacker venom, which is like a type of like wasp, basically, that their venom causes like hallucinations, and it's talked about as like specifically targeting the fear center of the brain. So when you're under the influence of this venom, like everything is super scary. And also, specifically, I think this is important, it also makes it challenging to know what is real. So yeah, like high, confused, terrified, and then being fed memories of Katniss to sort of distort those memories and those thoughts about Katniss. Anyways, all of that has happened to PETA, and when he is sort of like brought back to District 13, there's a lot of conversation, particularly from the rescue team, about how like, even though it wasn't like the easiest thing in the world to rescue him, like it was way easier than it should have been. So PETA has sort of been like changed and ruined and then delivered back to Katniss as a gift from President Snow to hurt her, which is like super challenging for everyone involved. Man. And I think the biggest thing is that like Katniss at some point realizes that PETA has been like the one person other than her family who, no matter what she does, no matter what happens, he supports her and has her back and loves her unconditionally. And now that's gone. And it's really challenging because I think, one, it's just sad. Like, it's sad to see the Capitol like succeed in trying to change someone's thoughts and feelings. I think that's just hard. But it's also challenging because it impacts the way that Katniss sees herself. So now that PETA is not just like unconditionally in love with her, she's like, right, like this one person who actually liked me now sees me for who I am, which is like terrible and violent and a killer. And that's hard too. Like, I don't know, it just affects her a lot, and it's really sad and it's really challenging. We see some progress with PETA throughout part 2, where like at first he can't even be in the same room as Katniss because he tries to kill her. Then he's able to like decorate a wedding cake for Finnick and Annie. And he's able to like have a conversation around Katniss and like not try to kill her. So there's some progress, but he's completely changed. And like, yeah, that's really tough. Anyways, that's kind of all we've seen so far with PETA. We'll talk more about him after part 3 for sure, but yeah. And then the last kind of main theme or area of focus in part 2 that I wanted to mention is the Capitol's control over and punishment of victors. So we hadn't, like, before this book, we know that it is not easy being a victor of the Hunger Games. We know that a lot of the previous victors have turned to drugs or alcohol, like the Morphlings and Haymitch. We know that, like, it's not, like, rosy and great. We know that Katniss has been like threatened by President Snow, that her family has been threatened by President Snow. So it's not like easy to be a victor, but we haven't totally seen the extent of that or like why. And in part 2, Finnick reveals his experience as a victor, and specifically talks about how President Snow sold him or sold his body to wealthy or like influential people in the capital. And that's super horrifying. And the implication is that like, and I don't even think it's an implication. I think he straight up says this, like he's not the only one. And that's really tough. And then we also find out that Haymitch's experience was that 2 weeks after he won the Hunger Games, his mom, brother, and girlfriend were killed because of his, like, the way that he won his games was by using the force field outside of the arena as a weapon. And that's not, of course, how the Capitol, like, intends for that to be used. So he was punished. And we don't know the details yet, which that's another thing that I think would be interesting to find out more of in this upcoming prequel. Maybe we'll find out. But like his family was killed, all of them, to punish him. So yeah. And that's like, those are the only people that we really know their story. We assume that it's a similar story for basically all of the victors. So it's like, it's just interesting. It's not a surprise, I guess, because again, we know the Capitol is evil, but it's interesting to see that additional level of control and punishment over everyone. Anyways, those were my main themes that I wanted to focus on. I also have some like random other things to mention. One, we find out that Snow came to power by poisoning his enemies and also his allies that were threats to him. And Katniss has this fun line that's like, poison is the perfect weapon for a snake. But yeah, so we know he loves poison. So that's fun. And like specifically, we find out that he got away with poisoning so many people by drinking from the same poisoned cup and then taking an antidote to the poison. But that he has like mouth sores from doing that, and that's why he smells like blood. So that's kind of gross, but very interesting. Also, when the rebels do attack the like nut in District 2, and they cause avalanches that like block all of the entrances to the inside of the mountain. We get this pretty impactful moment where Katniss imagines what that would be like, and she describes like alarms and not being able to like see where the exit is and smoke and all of this stuff. And like, I think it's an interesting and another just like impactful moment that Suzanne Collins put in the book to force us, the reader, to reconcile with. Like, it's not as simple as like, oh, an avalanche and now we win. Like, people are dying and they're terrified. And I think that's like a really sad, but again, impactful moment to have in the book. Also, we hear that Joanna's like head doctor constantly reminds her that she's totally safe, and Joanna and Katniss have this moment of like, what a joke, like we're victors of the Hunger Games, like that's not ever true, despite the fact that we're in District 13, like that's not true. And I think that's interesting. And also like, you can imagine how challenging their lives are to live their entire lives. I mean, Katniss has lived her entire life knowing that she's not safe, and that's gotta be rough. And then one last kind of like fun piece of lore that we get in this section is we learn the source of the name Panem, which is what the country is called. And it is from a Latin phrase, panem et circenses, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. But it means bread and circuses, and it is about, it's like from something, some Latin writing. I do not remember the exact history of this. I meant to look it up and forgot, but there's cool lore here. Thank you, Suzanne. But basically, it's a reference to the Romans giving up their like political involvement and power for like in exchange for entertainment and full bellies. And it's a really good analogy for the citizens in the Capitol. So that's a cool piece of information. That is all of my thoughts on part 2, which there were a lot, and I already know I'm gonna have a lot of thoughts on part 3 and the end of this book and the end of this series. I sort of forgot just how much this book in particular like really makes you think. So yeah, thank you for reading with me and thinking with me, and I will see you very soon for part 3. Okay, let's talk about part 3, The Assassin. So we ended part 2 with Peeta arriving to join the squad that Katniss is on with like Boggs and Gale and Finnick and everyone. So that's where we pick up in part 3. Peeta has arrived and the squad is sort of like reacting to that, and they set up a guard to watch him, and they like take the ammunition out of his gun and all that jazz. And then we go all the way through the very end of the book, which is the end of the war, and Katniss being sent to District 12 to live the remaining, like live the rest of her life there, because she's like kicked out of the capital basically for killing President Coin. So yeah, lots happened in part 3. So as usual, I have a couple of main themes or thoughts that I have for part 3. And incidentally, many of them are like comparing two things, which I didn't do on purpose. It's just the thoughts that I had. Anyways, the first thing that I want to talk about is Coin compared to Snow. So yeah, Coin and Snow are essentially two different sides of the war. So Coin is the leader of the rebels and Snow is the leader of the capital and like current Panem. So theoretically, they are completely at odds, although a lot of the war is sort of painted as, rather than Coin being against Snow, it's sort of like Katniss being against Snow, because Katniss is the face of the revolution and Coin is just kind of in the background pulling strings. But in reality, Coin leads the rebels, Snow leads the like capital and the peacekeepers, so it's Coin against Snow in terms of leadership. Despite that, Coin and Snow are actually very similar, and I think particularly in part 3 is when we start seeing just how similar they are, mostly related to how they treat Katniss, but also how they treat power and war. Both Coin and Snow use and manipulate Katniss and Peeta, but like mainly Katniss, and are driven by power and like want political power. Also, they are both willing to kill civilians and even children for the sake of war and power, etc. We know this to be true already, or we have known this for a long time about Snow, because he sanctions the Hunger Games. So that's killing children who have done nothing wrong, and that's been going on for years under his power. So obviously he's cool to kill kids. We know that Coin is willing to have like civilians and children die as well, because the rebels in the very, very end of the book, when like Katniss, the rebels, peacekeepers, everyone is sort of in the town circle right in front of the president's mansion, and the rebels come in and shoot people in the street, and they're aiming for peacekeepers, but they kill a bunch of like fleeing capital refugees, including at least one child that Katniss specifically sees be shot to death right in front of her. And like, it's not Coin there holding the gun, but I think since Coin is the leader of the rebels, like anything that happens under her control comes back to her. So the same as like Snow isn't in the Hunger Games, like specifically killing each of the children, it's still him doing it. So Coin, we know, is okay with civilians and children dying for the sake of war and power. We also know that both Snow and Coin do not like Katniss and probably want her dead. I think Snow has disliked Katniss from the beginning because she represents like this spark that ignites the rebellion. They've had beef kind of forever, whatever. But Coin, we don't know for sure how they feel about each other. And like Katniss is supposed to be on Coin's side because she's fighting for the rebels. So Coin should be on Katniss's side as well. But I think throughout this book, we see that Coin is not a huge fan of Katniss. And it really shows up in part 3 when Peeta is sent to join Katniss's squad, and that is a direct order from Coin. And we know that when Peeta shows up, Boggs, who is the like squad leader, is not happy about it, and he even calls Coin, but like ends that call frustrated, and Peeta stays. So like we know for sure Coin specifically sent Peeta to join their group, and it is probably because Coin knows that Peeta is unstable, and there's a very good chance that Peeta will just kill Katniss for her. A bigger point here is that Coin is willing to have Katniss die for maybe for the rebellion, but I think even bigger than that, so that Coin can have power and political power. And this is super similar to what we learn in part 3 about President Snow. Finnick reveals that President Snow would poison his enemies, but also his allies who were basically like threats to his power, and that is how he rose to power and rose to his like current position as president of Panem. So I think the big comparison here is that like Katniss is on Coin's side, sort of, but Coin is still willing to kill her or have her killed or, you know, risk her potentially dying. Like Coin is okay with her dying because Katniss stands in the way of Coin's like, you know, being the future president of Panem. And we know that it's not just Katniss that thinks this, because she has a conversation with Boggs. I think Boggs, I hope it's Boggs. It might be Gale, but she has a conversation with someone where basically she's like, does Coin really want me dead? And they're like, well, I mean, she denies it, but like kinda. And they're kind of talking about why that could be. And Boggs says, well, like after this whole war is over, there's going to be a new president of Panem, and Coin will want to be that president. And would you support her? And Katniss hesitates, and they say, if your immediate answer isn't yes, then you're a threat to her. So I just think that that's a story that seems really similar to everything that we know so far about Snow, of like even people that are on his side, he was willing to poison and kill so that he could ascend to power, and that's what Coin is okay with as well. Also, we find out at the very end of the book that Coin has Snow imprisoned like in his own house before he is like while he's tried and then executed. And he is staying like in his rose garden, and there is a point of like she's probably setting a precedent so that like even no matter how despicable they are, presidents get special treatment. And I think that's an interesting moment of like she knows she wants to be the president next, so she wants to set a precedent of how presidents, no matter what they do, are treated. And I just think that's an interesting point. And then I think there are two huge moments that really make Coin seem more similar to Snow that happen at the very end of the book. So the first one is the bombing that ultimately ends the war, and I am going to give you a little summary explanation of it. So at the very end of the book, Katniss and the rest of her, well, the remaining rest of her squad are trying basically to push forward and get into the president's mansion. Katniss wants to assassinate him, and basically right at that exact moment, the rebels also push through and arrive at the like capital or the city circle, which is right in front of the president's mansion in the capital. So everyone is here. It's like this, you know, final ultimate fight, basically. Katniss is there. Peacekeepers are there. The rebel fighters are there. There's also a ton of Capitol refugees and also children, like Capitol refugee children are there. So everyone is there. There is a like penned in area right in front of the Capitol's mansion that holds a bunch of children. So Capitol children who are theoretically, like the idea is President Snow announced that some people can move in, like refugees can move into his mansion. And so the idea is like these children are waiting to be brought into the president's mansion. But Katniss sees them as sort of being like a human shield. Whatever, regardless, there's like this caged area of children, and a hovercraft with the capital like symbol of Panem flies in, drops a bunch of parachutes over these children and flies away. And the children reach up for the parachutes because they're very like reminiscent of the Hunger Games, where parachutes in the games often mean like food or supplies or water, like something good. So these children all reach up for the parachutes and then they detonate bombs. The parachutes like had bombs and they all explode. And a bunch of the children die, some of them live. And then rebel medics come in to try to help, and the peacekeepers are like removing the barricades to get in and help the children. So it seemed like it was a surprise both to the peacekeepers and the rebels. Anyways, rebel medics run in, Katniss sees Prim, and then once the rebel medics are all in, and the peacekeepers, but like when people are in to help the children, a second round of bombs explode and kill all of those people. And Katniss is lit on fire. Her sister definitely dies. Prim is dead from that explosion. And that like ends the war. At first glance, because of the violence and the parachutes and the bombs and the hovercraft having the Capitol logo, it looks like this was something that the Capitol did. But Katniss starts to doubt that, particularly when she has a conversation with President Snow where he completely is like, I didn't do that, that was Coin. And then Katniss starts to realize reasons why it could be Coin, and kind of the argument for it being Coin is that, one, the double, like 2 different time exploding bomb thing was invented by Gale, and it's definitely possible, like it's feasible that the Capitol came up with the same thing, but we know for sure that Gale and Beatty came up with that idea. So District 13 definitely has it or knows about that idea. Also, it seems pretty suspicious that Prim, who is 13 years old at this point, would be sent into the literal front lines of war to help in this group of medics. And like, I think it makes sense for Prim to like agree to do that, but I don't, like, Katniss thinks, and I think we as the reader are led to think like, what leadership would say, yeah, a 13-year-old girl, front lines, great, we need medics. So that's kind of suspicious. So Katniss's theory is that this like double bomb explosion thing and Prim being there was orchestrated by Coin as a way to either like completely make Katniss go mad or get Katniss on Coin's side by like showing her that President Snow killed her little sister, who's like the most important person to her. And it kind of makes sense. Also, like Katniss points out that, you know, conveniently, I guess, for this scenario, Katniss is there and she firsthand witnesses Prim die, which is horrible. But even if she hadn't been there, the strategy would still have worked because there were tons of camera crews and like the rebels were specifically trying to make sure that the war was captured on camera. So like this strategy kind of like is sound, like it would work. And we don't ever get confirmation one way or another. Like we don't know for sure whose bombs they were, but like my personal opinion is that it was definitely Coin. It was definitely the rebels. We don't know for sure. Like it's not confirmed, and I think I like that it's not confirmed, but that's rough. It's rough. Anyways, I think that level of violence and that level of manipulation and once again, killing children, like refugee children who have done nothing wrong, and also just like civilians in general, but killing children, that like Coin is just like Snow. And then the last major argument for Coin and Snow being very similar is that at the very end of the book, Coin suggests a final symbolic Hunger Games. And President Snow did not invent the Hunger Games, which I don't know if that's like specifically information we know from these books, but like particularly we know from the prequel, which is the book I'm going to read next, that Snow doesn't really get involved. Like Snow is a kid when the Hunger Games are first invented, so he didn't come up with them, but he has, you know, they have been going on under his rule for a really long time. So even if they're not his idea, like they are his. So for Coin to suggest a Hunger Games, I think like she is willing to participate in the same like senseless violence of children that everyone, that like is the point of the rebellion, is that the capital is oppressive and kills children for no reason, and that's terrible, and Coin is suggesting the same thing. So anyways, I think this is something that's maybe been like brewing a little bit in earlier parts of the book, but I think that in this part of the book, in part 3, it's really like, hey, Coin's just going to be the new Snow, and that's really tough. The next theme in this book that I wanted to talk about is the comparison of the war in the book to the Hunger Games in the book. I think we see the war being similar to the games a lot throughout this book. We have like, you know, Katniss, who is a symbol in the games, being a symbol for the war. We have the propos where they're filming like, you know, televised little moments to advance the war efforts. Like there's a lot of little things. I think the first like major moment that compares the two, where like someone says it out loud, happens in part 2, I think. And it's the first time that Katniss sees the Hollow, which shows like a map of the capital and points out all of the different pods, which are like little traps that when triggered will cause some sort of like violence or weapon that is very similar to things that happen in the Hunger Games. It's particularly similar to the stuff that we saw in the 75th Hunger Games, where like different sections caused different like weapons or different ways for people to die. So it's really similar to that. And when Katniss sees that, she says like, "May the 76th Hunger Games begin," or something like that. So you know, it's not new for this section. But yeah, so I think a huge thing in this section that furthers this idea of the war being similar to the Hunger Games is all of the pods. So while Katniss and her squad are in the capital, they experience like a ton of different pods that trigger. There's a pod that is just a bomb, and that's how Boggs dies. There is another pod that triggers this like wave of black goo that the fumes can kill people. There's another pod that just like scoops someone up in a bunch of barbed wire. There's a pod that emits like a beam of light that melts someone. There's, you know, a pod, like there's all these different pods that have these like really horrific ways of killing people. And we get to see a lot of them through Katniss's squad. There's also a bunch of mutts that come after Katniss and her group that are like lizard-like and kind of gross. There's another section later that I don't know if it's a pod, but like an entire city block just like dumps open and people fall to their death, or there's also like creatures that kill people. Like it's very similar to the like random things that the game makers trigger in the Hunger Games, the mutts in the Hunger Games, and just like that kind of created violence. There's also a moment after the capital thinks that Katniss and the rest of her crew are dead, after Boggs' legs are exploded and there's like the wave of black goo, whatever. They actually escape, but the capital thinks they're dead, and they play on television that night all of their faces as like it's similar to at each night in the Hunger Games where they show the faces of all the dead tributes. They show the faces of all the dead rebels. So like on television, they're televising this war as if it's the televised presentation of the Hunger Games. Also, the bombs being delivered in parachutes that are super reminiscent of the Hunger Games, which it's not clear who is responsible for that, but still it's very Hunger Games-esque. And then also Katniss having a prep team at the very end of the war for Snow's execution, so that she's like made camera ready. Like she literally has her Hunger Games prep team again. So there's a lot of parallels between this war and the Hunger Games. The next thing that I wanted to talk about, or the next like theme in this section, is the like cost of this war. I think in this section in particular, we're really made to see like so many people are dead. Prim, Katniss's little sister, who again is the most important person to her in the whole entire world, she dies. Most of Katniss's like squad, I think by the end, the only people that are still alive are like 2 of the camera crew, and then Katniss, Peeta, and Gale. So almost everyone's dead. There are tons of just like capital and district civilians that are dead, and also tons of children that are dead. And we hear so much about how many people are dead. Like there's a lot of death in this section. And then also another kind of cost of this war is that Katniss and Gale will probably, like, we don't know because it's the end of the book and we don't know every single detail about everyone after the end of the book. But by the end of the story, like, there's very little chance of Katniss and Gale reconciling and ever being friends or even speaking again, because Katniss thinks that Gale's bombs are responsible for killing her sister. And like that is a rift that will never be bridged. Yeah, so like that relationship is another cost of this war. And I don't know, there's tons of stuff, and like war is terrible. Like, of course, there's tons of violence, there's tons of death, but I think in this section in particular, we really see like here is every person that's dying and everything that's lost. And I think that's really important and interesting. And then the last like major theme that I wanted to discuss from part 3 is another comparison. And that's the comparison of Peeta and Gale. And like, I really like Peeta and Gale as characters in this book and in this series because they're not just like cute boys. Like I think you can read this book and see this like little love triangle of like Katniss, who's she gonna pick, Peeta or Gale? Which boy? Which cute boy? And that's fun. Like a love triangle is so fun. But I think Peeta and Gale both represent something so much bigger than just like a cute boy for Katniss to pick between. I think that Peeta represents peace and hope, and I think that that's not just something from the very end of this book, but something that we see through the entire series. Like literally the first interaction that Katniss has with Peeta, he is giving her bread that saves her family's life. Like he represents hope and survival and possibility. And Gale, I think, represents war and violence, and he has this like fiery rage in him. And I think Gale actually does also represent survival, but in a very different way. But yeah, I think Gale represents violence. I think like what's super interesting about both Peeta and Gale is that they both help Katniss live, or survive, but in super different ways. Like Peeta is caring. He like feeds Katniss. Literally, again, that first interaction with the bread, he's constantly caring for her. And Gale also cares for Katniss, but like Gale and Katniss have this relationship that is, you know, was created out of a mutual need to survive the worst possible conditions, and their friendship is like clawing on to whatever they have in order to survive. So that like they just represent two very different things that Katniss or like people need. Also, Gale is unfortunately forever associated with the death of Katniss's sister Prim. Because there is a possibility that Gale's like bombs were responsible for Prim's death, he is forever attached to the death of Prim. And like interestingly, Peeta, the first time that we see him in District 12 after the war, the first thing that he's doing is planting primrose around Katniss's house, like to honor Prim. And like I don't know the particulars of that. Like, it's weird because like Gale has always had this goal of protecting Katniss's family, protecting Prim, and he can't. He doesn't. Like something that he creates is why she dies. And Peeta, he doesn't make promises to protect Prim, but like I don't know, he just cares for her in a way. He honors her for Katniss, and I think that's huge. I don't know. One of the last lines in the book is, "What I need is the dandelion in spring," and that's when she's talking about if she will choose to be with Gale or with Peeta, and how it's not Gale's like fiery rage that she needs, it's Peeta's like hope and care. And I think that that sums up this book and the three of them really well. And like, I don't know, I have a lot of thoughts on Peeta and Gale, and I think like part of it is that Katniss could not have survived without Gale. Gale and his rage and his violence were absolutely necessary to get through this story. But now now she needs peace. And I think that's like kind of the message or a message of this book. Like, we know that the plot of this book and this trilogy, overthrowing the capital, rising up, having the districts join together and wage war against the capital, that couldn't happen without violence. Like, it was absolutely necessary to drive this story forward. Like, I don't think that there is a world, I don't think you can make the argument that a revolution in this world was possible without violence. I just don't think that's possible. However, like, violence has a major cost, and we also have to reconcile with that in this story. And I think like where we end at the end of this is that we have to choose peace afterwards. So I don't know. I think this is a complicated book and a complicated story and a complicated set of three people, but it's really interesting to compare like what Gale represents, what Peeta represents, and what Katniss needs at various points of her life. Anyways, those are all of my major thoughts about part 3. I have a lot more to talk about on the entire book, but I'll be back for that in just a second. I'm gonna drink like a ton of water. I've been yapping a lot. So we finished Mockingjay, the third and final book in the original Hunger Games trilogy. I have some thoughts to share with you on the whole entire book. But first, I realized that in this, like while talking about this book, I wasn't telling you about all the times that I cried while reading it, which is something that I did with the other books. So I'm gonna go through rapid fire, tell you about all of the times that I cried throughout this book. So in part 1, I actually only cried one time, and it's in chapter 6. There is a conversation that Katniss has with Haymitch after Haymitch has like sobered up in District 13 and they kind of reunite, and they're talking about Peeta, and Katniss says to Haymitch, "I can't believe you didn't rescue Peeta." And then she says something like, "Okay, now you say it to me." And Haymitch says, "I can't believe you let him out of your sight that night." And that part really got me because they both made a promise to one another to save Peeta, and they both messed up. And so I cried. Anyways, just one cry in part 1, so not too bad. In part 2, I cried 2 times. The first time was actually another Katniss and Haymitch moment when Katniss is trying to film the like propo, the like District 13 is alive and well and so am I propo, and she can't because she's had this realization that anything she does will be taken out as punishment on Peeta, and like everyone realizes that she's realized that, and it's sad. Anyways, Katniss gets really upset and she only wants Haymitch's comfort because he loves Peeta too, and that part got me as well because it's just again these two people that like they failed Peeta, and that's awful. The next time that I cried in part 2 was in chapter 16, where Peeta sits down at the like lunch table with everyone and is being pretty cruel to Katniss, like, which is fair. But he says, "I must have loved you a lot." And that part made me cry because like the implication that he doesn't anymore and that the capital was able to like take that from him is just really sad. That part got me. And then we're on to part 3, and I'm actually not going to tell you exactly how many times I cried yet. I'll just take you through the moments. The first time that I cried in part 3 was in chapter 22 when Finnick dies, and Katniss has this moment of imagining different like moments in his life. And that really got me. I think Finnick is a character that I really, really liked and became super attached to. So that was really sad. And it was also just really like kind of gut-wrenching to remember that he had this whole life in his district, in the water, doing all these different things. He had this love with Annie that we don't even know that much about. There are so many moments of his life that we don't know about, and he is dead. And it's just very sad. And then also, basically right after that, the next time that I cried was when Katniss is trying to kind of like get Peeta to calm down because he's about to lose it after this whole moment with all of the mutts and Finnick dying, and Peeta's like really on the edge. And Katniss at one point says, "Stay with me," and Peeta responds, "Always." And it is a callback to their, like, this moment that they had in book 2. And yeah, that made me cry. I was potentially already kind of sad still because of Finnick, but still, that moment made me cry. The next time I cried in part 3 was when Prim died. But specifically, there's like a whole moment right before Prim dies where Katniss is in the city circle and she sees Prim with the other rebel medics going up to help the children. And Prim has the back of her shirt untucked and it makes a little ducktail, which is exactly what she noticed about Prim in book 1, the beginning of book 1, during the reaping, when Prim starts to walk up and she has her shirt untucked like a little ducktail. And the moment when Prim dies is like so devastating. Obviously, I think Prim is a character that Katniss is very attached to, and so we as the reader become very attached to. But having this really full circle callback to the very beginning of the series was so tough because, like, for me, it made me remember that, like, in the very beginning of the first book of this series, Prim is supposed to die. She was reaped for the Hunger Games. And the reason that she doesn't is that Katniss volunteers to take her place and saves her and protects her from the Hunger Games. And in this moment, it's the same, you know, Katniss seeing her little sister, who is only 13 years old right now, with her untucked shirt. And now she can't protect her. She can't save her. She can't do anything to stop the violence that happens moments later. And oh, putting in the untucked shirt, it really made the moment so much harder for me. So yeah, anyways, that was the next moment I cried. I'm smiling because I'm trying to make sure I don't cry again right now. The next moment in part 3 that I cried was, oh God, okay. I'm gonna cry talking about these. Was in chapter 26 when Katniss and Gale are talking, and Katniss asks Gale, "Was it your bomb?" And Gale says that he and Beetee don't know for sure whose bomb it was. And then Gale says, "Does it matter? You'll always be thinking about it." And that part really got me too, because I think this whole conversation, like, again, Gale tries so hard throughout this whole entire series to protect Katniss, to protect her family, to protect Prim. And it's possible, he doesn't know for sure, we don't know for sure, but it's possible that something that he created is the reason that she's dead. And it's so hard because, like, yeah, Katniss will never be able to look past that, will never be able to forgive him, but also it must be awful for Gale as well. It's just a really tough moment, and that part made me cry. And then the next time that I cried in part 3 was in chapter 27 when Katniss is back in District 12. She's living in her, like, Victor's Village house, and Buttercup, Prim's cat, shows up and he's like wounded and thin, and it seems like he probably walked all the way from District 13 back to District 12 looking for Prim. And that, like, really sets Katniss off, and she kind of loses it for a minute in her grief for Prim. And she's like yelling at the cat and she says, "She's dead, you stupid cat, she's dead." For whatever reason, I think that's the part that, like, hits me the hardest in the whole entire book. I think, like, seeing Katniss really fall apart for a minute in her feelings for Prim, it really hits me hard. Anyways, we're good. We're good. And then the very last time that I cried in this book is just after that, when Katniss has this idea to record the information about all of the, like, people basically that she has lost, in, like, similar to her family book with all of the plants. She wants to make a book with, like, pictures of the people that have died and information about them, and she talks about, like, Rue, and it's just, yeah, I don't know. I like that moment a lot, and I think I like that there are so many opportunities in this book for us to remember the dead and remember what what the Hunger Games, the Capitol, the war, what all of this has cost everyone. And I like that Katniss wants to recognize that. Those are all the times that I cried in book 3. I cried 10 times in total. 7 of those times were in part 3. So yeah, I was a mess finishing this book. In summary, I loved this book. Absolutely loved this book. Same with the rest of the series. These are my favorite books. I love them so much. I think it was interesting rereading Mockingjay so closely because I almost feel like I have not given this book enough credit in the past. I've talked about a lot how in this series, my favorite book of the 3 in the trilogy is the second book, Catching Fire. And I think for some reason in my head, I'm sort of like, Hunger Games, great. Catching Fire, incredible. Mockingjay, great. But Mockingjay is really, really solid as a book. I still think Catching Fire is my favorite, but I just think there were so many moments in this book that I had looked over in the past and I didn't realize just how incredible and kind of like biting and tough this book is. So I really enjoyed this reread and reading it so closely. I really only have one kind of whole book thought to share, and it is that I think this book really makes us think about fiction versus reality, or at least for me, rereading it, particularly rereading it as an adult, it's hard to read this book and not think about real life. Suzanne Collins does a really good job of creating fictional stories that make us ask really big questions, or hold on to really big, challenging thoughts. And she doesn't like give us answers or tell us what's right or wrong, but I think she's just very good at forcing us to think about these really challenging things. And like some of the major things that I think I was thinking about while reading this book are like, how is it okay for humans to come up with such complex justifications for violence? Particularly for violence against innocent people. What types of violence should humans commit? Are there types of violence that should be off the table? And who decides? Who can choose what violence someone deserves or someone is okay to commit? And like, is there a type of violence, a type of weapon that is just not acceptable? And like some of the moments that I think about are like the bombing of District 8, where the Capitol bombed a hospital. I think that's a moment that you're supposed to, I think while reading that, that's so unbelievably unacceptable and not okay and crosses a line. And that's something that happens in real life. Like, it's not just fiction. And like all of the pods in the Capitol that come up with these like really truly heinous and cruel forms of violence. And sure, a lot of them are fictional, but some of them aren't. And there are forms of violence that humans in real life commit that are just as heinous and cruel and shouldn't be allowed. I don't think that there are answers to these questions, or I don't think there's a clear line, but I think that like reading this book, it's really hard to just let it just be fiction. And I think that's super interesting. There's a line in the very final chapter of the book where Katniss, like our narrator, thinks something is significantly wrong with a creature that sacrifices its children's lives to settle its differences. And I think that is one of those lines where like, it's not fiction, it's real life. And I think finishing this book, that's very much what I'm thinking about. So yeah, this was a really tough read, but a really, really incredible book. I can't say enough how much I love this story and how I think impactful it is. Yeah. So I have finished my reread of the Hunger Games trilogy, the first 3 books, but we are not done with this series. There are 2 prequels that I'm going to be reading. The next book in my list of books to read is The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which is the first prequel to the Hunger Games. It covers the early days of President Snow, who during the book is just Coriolanus Snow. So I'm going to read that one next, and then basically by the time I finish that book in a week-ish, the next prequel will be published, and I will read that one next. That's Sunrise on the Reaping, and it covers background on Haymitch and specifically his Hunger Games that he wins, which is the 50th Hunger Games. So I'm going to read both of those, so we're not done with the series. So yeah, more Hunger Games content to come. I do want to say a huge thank you if you have watched this video or any of the videos in this little series that I'm doing. Thank you so much. It's been really fun making these and just talking about all of my very many thoughts on these books. I have been really bad about saying this. I keep meaning to mention this in previous videos, but if you have read these books, if you have any thoughts, I would really love to hear what you think in the comments. If we have any thoughts in common, things that we agree on, I would love to hear. But also if there's anything that I said that you disagree with, I would really like to hear that, because something that I really enjoy about reading is getting to compare the way that we interpret text. So I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. Also, like I said, we're not done with this series, but I do only have 2 more Hunger Games books to read. And I would love to know, if you like this type of content where I deep dive on a book and tell you all of my thoughts, do you have any other books that you would like to hear my thoughts on? Do you have any suggestions or requests? Because I might do more of these, or I might just do chill things. I might take a little break from deep dive reading. But either way, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you very soon for The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Yeah.